Sometimes it can feel as if God is not working for the good of His people, that He's just not doing much of anything for the good of His people. I remember one time when I felt like God was not doing much good in my own life. I was frustrated at the time. And I remember reading Jeremiah chapter 50, and there's a text in Jeremiah chapter 50 in verse 7 in which it describes God as a habitation or a field in some translations of righteousness. I remember thinking in my frustration at that time, yeah, God, you are like a field in some ways. Sometimes it seems like you just are laying there doing nothing. No matter what I want and I long for you to do, you're doing nothing, it feels like. But then something occurred to me in that moment. Yes, God is like a field. That just like a field, when you look at it, it seems like it's just doing nothing. It's just laying there. But if you look beneath the surface, it's absolutely teeming with life. There's all sorts of creatures and bugs and all sorts of growth going on in terms of plants, all of it going on beneath the surface in ways that we don't readily see. Now, I'm not pretending that Jeremiah was making that primary point in Jeremiah chapter 50. But I do think it was part of Jesus' point that he was making in John chapter 5, when he said to some people who were criticizing him, "My Father is always at work. My Father is always working." Now, when I look at church history, I think that's a helpful thing to remember, that sometimes it can feel as if God wasn't doing much of anything. It seems like the church was corrupt and there were all sorts of misuses of power and all of that. And yet, in the midst of all of that, God was truly and authentically working for the good of His people. Now, what I want to do in our time together in this session is for us to look at some people in the Middle Ages, at a time when to many of us it may look like, it may seem like, that God wasn't doing much of anything, and show that even during that time that may seem so dark to so many of us as we look at it, during that time, God was doing amazing things among and for His people. Let's take a look at some of these things. I want to look first off and recognize that God was working among the monks. We've talked a little bit in different sessions about the monks, and I want us to realize that God was working among them. You see, some of them were missionaries. One of my favorite missionary monks was a man named Boniface. Now, Boniface was born in England, and he was a monk who taught in a school that was at the monastery. And it came to a point at which the head of the monastery, who was called an abbot, and an abbot isn't Costello's skinnier sidekick. What an abbot was, it's a word that also means father. It was the person who was over the monastery. And the abbot of his monastery died, and they wanted Boniface to replace the abbot of the monastery, and Boniface didn't want to. So he ended up heading to Rome and then eventually realizing that his calling was to be a missionary. And the Pope in Rome called him to be a missionary to the Germans. And so one of the things that Boniface did is he went as a missionary to the Germans. And so in this particular place, the Germans had a tree that they considered to be a sacred tree, and it was called the Oak of Thor. And Boniface went to this tree that they revered, the German people around him, and called out and said, "May God strike me. If your God is the real God, may He strike me dead if I cut down this tree." And Boniface took out an axe and began to chop down the oak tree of Thor. And just as he began to chop it down, a great wind came and uprooted the tree and tore down the tree, and the people all around him recognized the power of the true God, and they turned to faith in Jesus Christ. And what Boniface did is, after this tree had fallen and these people had turned in faith to Jesus Christ, he built a church for them, a church building, out of the tree that had once been the oak tree of Thor. Now, he also had a relative, and her name was Leoba, and he convinced her to come over across the English Channel. They were from England, and he convinced her to come over with 11 nuns to build a community that included not only a monastery, but also a convent. And so what would happen is that many of the monks would go out and try to help people with farming, while the nuns ran hospitals, and together they witnessed to the people who are around them, the German people. There came a point at which Boniface wanted to go to this region known as Phrygia, up in Germany and the Netherlands. And so he called together many people, and many of them expressed an interest in trusting Jesus Christ. And then he was going to gather them together for a confirmation class of sorts, that is, letting them know what they were trusting in when they were trusting in Jesus Christ. But while he was there with his fellow monks, they were attacked by a group of thieves and brigands. Now, they had arms, and they decided that some of them, that we would fight against them. But when he and his fellow monks were there and his fellow monks picked up their arms to fight against these brigands who had come, Boniface said this to them. He said, "My sons, cease fighting, lay down your arms, for we are told in Scripture not to render evil for good, but to overcome evil by good. The hour to which we have long looked forward is near, and the day of our release is at hand. Take comfort in the Lord. Endure with gladness the suffering he has mercifully ordained. Put your faith in him, and he will grant deliverance to your souls." And so he and his companions gave their lives at that point for the sake of the gospel. So after the brigands had murdered Boniface and his companions, they tore open the trunks that the monks had had because they thought, surely these are full of gold or silver or something precious. And when they tore them open, all they found were the monks' books. And they became angry and they began to strike the books with their axes. And still today, there is a book known as the Ragendrudum Codex that still has the axe marks upon it that these men left in their rage after killing Boniface. Now, it wasn't just Western monks that were missionaries. In 862, the overseer of Constantinople sent a man named Cyril as a missionary to the Slavic people in Moravia. Before he left home, Cyril invented his own alphabet so he could translate the Bible into the Moravian language. But his mission ran into problems before it even started. Roman missionaries said the scriptures and the church's worship should only be translated into holy languages, like Latin, not ordinary languages that people could actually comprehend. So Cyril and his brother Methodius headed to Rome to appeal to the Pope. Now the Pope said Cyril could translate the scriptures under one condition. Cyril had to place his mission under the Pope's control. Cyril submitted to the Pope, but then Cyril died before he could even make it back to Moravia. But Methodius, his brother, kept working among the Moravians. But the Moravians couldn't understand Cyril's translations. And around 895, invaders forced the successors of Cyril and Methodius to run to Bulgaria. No trace remained of Cyril's mission among the Moravians. From a human viewpoint, those brothers failed miserably. And yet, in Bulgaria, their efforts began to bear some fruit. Cyril's successors refined their master's missionary methods. They preached and they worshiped in the language of the people. They even adapted Cyril's original alphabet into Bulgarian. By the year 900, Bulgaria had become the center of Slavic Christianity. Cyril's alphabet, it became known as Cyrillic, and it became the most common alphabet in Southeast Europe and Russia. When Cyril and his brother died, they seemed like fruitless failures, and yet years later, God transformed their failure into fruit. So some of the monks were missionaries, like Boniface and his relative Leobas. Some of them even gave their lives for their faith. But there were other monks that were reformers. You see, some of the monasteries really needed reform by this time because many of them had really lost their zeal, their passion for purity. Some of them had even gotten under the control of some corrupt nobles. Now, in the year 909, there was a man named Duke William of Aquitaine, and he decided he wanted to found a new monastery. Now, he enlisted a man named Brno to lead this monastery. So Brno brought Duke William some really unwelcome news. And the news was the best place for us to build a monastery is Cluny. And the area of Cluny was where Duke William had his hunting dogs. And so William objected and said, that's my prime hunting ground right there. That's my prime hunting ground that I use. It was right where you're wanting to build your monastery. And Brno said that providing for your hunting dogs will provide no eternal reward, but providing for monks might. And so here's what Duke William had to say afterwards. He said, to all right thinkers, it is clear that the providence of God has so provided for certain rich men that by means of their possessions, if they use them well, they may be able to merit everlasting rewards. I, William, Count and Duke by the grace of God, have considered it advisable that I should give some little portion for the gain of my soul. Now we see a couple of things in these words from Duke William. First off, somebody who really has a desire to do something right. But we also see the degree to which people were often doing things right, not as a response to God's grace, but to earn God's grace. But nevertheless, Duke William did give over this land Cluny to the monastery for a new monastery to be built. He handed it over to them, and to make absolutely certain that no one controlled it, no corrupt noble controlled it, that it would stay in the hands of these monks, he handed over the deed to the apostles Peter and Paul, and said, the monks there shall not be subject to any earthly power. And in fact, he said, if anyone tries to take over this, Let him incur the wrath of God, and let him experience in his own body putrefying and swarming with vermin. So Duke William was pretty serious about making sure that nobody else could control this particular monastery. Now, what happened there is at Chme is a very strong emphasis on absolute purity. And this caused a revival of sorts. And what I mean by a revival in this sense is that people began to compare their own priests or their own bishops to the purity and the holiness of the monks at Chme. And the hunger for holiness that people saw at Chme influenced people to want more radical reforms in the church. They wanted a purity among their leaders in the church, and they began to call for that. And it all began when one duke traded his finest hunting dogs for a monastery full of monks. But even Chme ended up having some difficulties. You see, a few years after all of these reforms at the monastery at Chme, these communities became so well known that every royal person in France wanted to sponsor them. And by the early 1000s, the monks and the nuns at Chme no longer were laboring, no longer were caring for the poor as they had when they had started, and gold and jewels absolutely plastered their chapel walls because everybody wanted to be the patron of this particular community. So in the year 1098, there were about 21 monks from Chme that decided they wanted to return to the original vision for this community. And so they developed a new religious community near the city of Cistercium, or Citeaux, in France. And they became known as the Cistercian monks. Now, their rule was so strict to even avoid the appearance of wealth, they didn't even dye their robes. So they wore white robes. To this very day, Cistercian monks wear white robes. And it comes from this desire that we don't in any way want to look as if we have any wealth. But within a few years, it became clear that there was a real problem with this Cistercian monastery, and that is nobody was joining it. And nobody was joining it because the lifestyle was simply too strict. Now, the abbot of this community was just about to give up. He was preparing to quit when suddenly there was a knock at the gate. And when he went to answer the knock, he saw not one, not five, but 31 men who were there to join this community. All of them wanted to become monks, and one of them, his name was Bernard of Clairvaux. He would become one of the mightiest monks of the Middle Ages. Now, in one sense, Bernard, it was almost like he ruled the Roman Church for several decades. He criticized Chme's lavish lifestyle, but one of the things that's important about him is the degree to which he tried to focus people on truly loving God. He said this. He said, "The reason for our loving God is God, yet every soul that seeks God has already been anticipated by Him. He sought you before you began to seek Him." He called persons truly not just to try to obey God and not to earn God's favor, but to truly love God and let their good deeds flow out of that love for God. Bernard saw the love of God as so important and our response of love for God that he talked about 4 levels of divine love. He said, everybody starts out with love of self for self's sake. He said that's where you all start out, every one of us, where we love ourselves for the sake of ourself. He said then as we come to understand God and God draws us toward Himself, we may end up loving God for the sake of self. That is, we love God, but we love God for what we can get out of God. But he said, then we move toward love of God for God's sake, simply loving Him for who He is. But he said, as we truly are drawn into the love of God, we eventually get to a 4th level of divine love. And that is love of self or love of my life for God's sake. Now, what he meant by that is simply that whatever happens in my life, whatever comes, whatever may be, I love God anyway. I love what is happening in my life because I know that it comes from the hand of a God who loves me. And so you begin to see, because of the influence of Bernard, even the art of the church begins to change. Whereas before they had increasingly shown God as an angry judge, and even Jesus as an angry judge, more and more you begin to see images that also include not only the holiness of God, but also the love of God, even in the art of the churches. So God was working among the monks. He was working among monks who were missionaries. He was also working among monks who are reformers. There's another area that God was truly working in, even in the Middle Ages, and that is among people who became known as mendicants. To understand what a mendicant is, first we have to understand some of what was going on in the economics of this time. You see, land was giving way to money as the measure of wealth. And you think, why does it make any difference that land was once the source of wealth and then it becomes money? Well, it makes a big difference because then your wealth becomes portable. You can't transport your field or your house from one place to another very easily, but you can transport coins and things like that. So as land gives way to money, you have a more portable form of wealth. Here's something else that happens when land gives way to money as a measure of economic value. People can become specialized because after all, you don't have to produce everything that you eat and everything that you live in and everything that you do. You don't have to produce it all yourself or on a relatively small area. You can trade money to get the things you need. So you can have a specialized business or something specialized that you do that you get cash for and then purchase what you need. Now, we live in this type of an economy all the time, so it doesn't seem very odd to us that it's that way, but it was a transition, a shift in society in which land was once the measure of wealth and then money became the measure of wealth. We think, why does this matter and how does it connect to the history of the church and these people called mendicants? Well, it makes a big difference to do with mendicants because mendicants were people who traveled around preaching. They would travel around preaching. So in other words, what had happened is that society became more mobile, and a mobile society required a mobile preacher, we might say. So there were people who were known as mendicants who would travel around to preach. Now, one of them was named Peter Waldo. Peter Waldo. Let me tell you a little bit about Peter Waldo. He's a fascinating story. There was a singer on the street corner who told a story or staged a play about a nobleman who gave away all his wealth. And there was a man named Waldo in the audience. He became later known as Peter Waldo, and he was a French merchant, and he seems to have been pretty wealthy. And so he gave away his wealth and committed himself to Christ. He funded a French translation of the Bible, and he became a preacher. Now, Waldo became disturbed as he studied the scriptures. And here's what disturbed him. He didn't find any references to purgatory, even though that's what he had been taught in the church. He didn't find any references to the supreme power of the Pope, even though that had been taught to him. And as a result, he rejected both ideas. Now, his fresh focus on Scripture, it soon attracted a band of followers, and they became known as the poor folk of Lyons. Now, all the poor folk, including the women, they learned the Scriptures in their own language and began to share the gospel with people around them. So eventually, Waldo went to the Pope and asked the Pope to approve his movement. And so the Pope said, you can preach, you can proclaim the gospel, your group can continue, but there's one condition. You can only preach when and where a bishop tells you you can preach. Well, this didn't work out. And finally, some of the poor folk of Lyons, they preached at a time and in a place where a bishop hadn't asked them to, and they were booted out of the church, excommunicated. They were under the condemnation of the church. Some of them returned to the Roman church, but most of them kept on preaching despite the condemnation. Now, it's very clear from their own writings and the writings of others that the followers of Peter Waldo, who became known as Waldensians, that they believed the essentials of the Christian faith. It says, for example, in some of their own writings, we believe all that is contained in the Apostles' Creed. We acknowledge for sacred canonical scriptures the books of the Holy Bible. We consider the sacraments to be signs of holy things, visible emblems of invisible blessings. In other words, the sacraments, the Lord's Supper and baptism are symbols. They don't actually do something. They are symbols of visible emblems of invisible blessings. And so you had some mendicants that were in some sense outside the church, or at least they challenged the church's authority. But there were also others as well, others who did not challenge the authority of the church. And one young man who would end up as a mendicant monk and as a leader, in fact, of this movement, he began as a 22-year-old cloth merchant's son, as a soldier of a city in France, and his name was Giovanni, but his nickname was Francis, and he becomes known as Francis of Assisi. Now, what happens to him is he had a vision as he was traveling to a battle of the crucified Christ. And after he had this vision, he returned home absolutely and utterly transformed and absolutely committed to a life of poverty. In fact, when somebody asked him, "Why are you so happy now?" it says, "Because I have gotten married, and the one I have married is Lady Poverty." Now, he became very frustrating to his father because every time he got money from his rather wealthy father, he would give it away. He would give it away. He would sell some of his father's cloth to prepare a chapel. He would give away whatever he received because he had, in his own words, married Lady Poverty. And so Francis's angry father brought him in front of the bishop. And so the bishop and Francis's father and Francis are here together. And so what Francis does at this point is something I don't necessarily recommend doing in front of your father and the bishop. He just takes off his clothes. He drops all of his clothes, his lavish clothes that had identified him as a wealthy merchant's son. And he said to his father, "Until today, I called you Father. Now I can say honestly, our Father in heaven, in him alone I place my faith." And so he ended up with a tattered brown robe. He chalked a cross on it. And as he left, he grabbed off of a scarecrow a rope and tied it around his waist. To this very day, Franciscan monks wear brown robes tied with a rope at the waist. And he said, "Grant me, Jesus, that I may never own anything under heaven of my own." Now, a few years later, Francis went to Pope Innocent III, the same one who had initiated the Fourth Crusade that we've already talked about. And he asked him if he could start an order of friars minor, that is, brothers lesser brothers, friars minor. Now, each Franciscan friar or brother could own 2 tunics, nothing more. And the tunics had to be simple and brown with a rope around the waist, just like Francis had in the beginning. And Pope Innocent III, he thought the rules were a bit too harsh, but he approved them anyway. And then in 1214, a few years later, Pope Innocent III even allowed a nun named Clare to take up the Franciscan lifestyle. So there was both Francis and Clare of Assisi who were overseeing these orders of monks that emphasized poverty. And oh, did Francis emphasize poverty. In fact, there was one point at which one of the brothers, the friars, came to him all excited because somebody had given him a gold coin. And what Francis did at that point is made the man put the gold coin between his teeth and bury it in a pile of dung because he said that's where gold belongs. Now, whatever one may think about Francis's exact techniques, it's very clear that God was up to something even in the Middle Ages. He was up to something among missionary monks, among reforming monks, among people who became mendicants. And there was another mendicant order, and this one focused on preaching. And they were known as the Dominicans. They focused on preaching, on going around, traveling around the country and preaching. Now, one of them was a man named Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas. Now, Thomas Aquinas is a very unlikely individual to become a hero in church history. He was quiet. According to most reports, it seems that he was clumsy and overweight. And when he was about 20 years old, he decided to join the Dominicans, a group of black-robed mendicant monks. Now, his parents had other plans, though. Their plans were for him to become an archbishop, not a wandering preacher, because they knew that a wandering preacher would never gain much in the world's goods. But an archbishop in their day could very much. And so his brothers kidnapped him, and it was later claimed that for 15 months straight, they imprisoned Thomas and they tempted him with prostitutes and prestigious positions, and yet he remained unmoved. He said, "I'm not going to do anything but become a monk and one who travels around and one who is a preacher." Now, in the year 1245, Thomas escaped from his family's castle. He fled to the University of Paris, and there he began to study, and even there, he ended up being unpopular. It seems that he had very poor social skills, and others looked at him and they called him the dumb ox. And yet none of them ever suspected that this ox's bellow would resound not just throughout the world in his own day, but throughout history. You see, 11 years later, by that time, he was teaching at the university, and his teachings transformed Christian theology. Because before, philosophy had been considered in some sense by some to be the devil's domain. And yet Thomas Aquinas brought together the philosophies of men like Aristotle together with God's revelation. And he brought them together in such a way that he saw the physical world as a signpost, as what we learn from the physical world around us and what we learn from even the pagan learning to be able to help us understand, because the order in it points to the reality, even in the pagans, it points to the reality of God. Now, in 1266, he began his masterpiece, which was the Summa Theologica, or the summation of theology, and he worked on this for 7 years. If you look at the English translation of this, it's not just one book or 2 books, it's about 4,000 pages in the English translation, and yet he chose never to finish this particular project. And the reason he chose never to finish this, we don't know for certain, but we know that in 1273 something happened. He was celebrating the Mass of St. Nicholas, and he heard a voice speaking to him and declared that I desire only Christ now. Now, he had a secretary who had been with him many years, and this secretary said to him, urged him after this point to continue writing on this magnum opus, this major project of the Summa Theologica. And he responded to Reginald and said, I cannot, because all that I have written now seems like straw to me. Somehow he had had some experience of Jesus Christ, that he looked at even this massive masterpiece that he had developed and said, even that, it just seems like straw to me. His last words were, I receive you, the ransom of my soul. For the love of you, I have studied, kept vigil, worked, and preached, and taught. Now, these are just a few examples, the ones that I've given you, of how God was working even in the Middle Ages. Even at this time that to many of us, we look at that and we think there's corruption in that time period. We look at that and say, look at all these political power plays that were going on. How can God be working in the church even then and even there? And yet the truth is that we see that God was working even then and even there. God never stops working. That's what Jesus was saying in John chapter 5. My Father is always at work. My Father is always at work. Remember, when you look at your life, when you look at your church, and sometimes you look and you realize you just become frustrated. It seems like God is not doing much of anything. And yet remember the Middle Ages. Remember the people we've talked about. At a time that some people have called the Dark Ages. During that time, God is at work. And even in your dark ages, in your life and in your church, somewhere, somehow, perhaps beneath the surface, God is at work. So look for it. Be ready. Embrace it. My Father, Jesus said, never stops working.